medical ethics is being inverted. Find out about that and more in today's edition of Life Matters. Brian Johnston is the Western Director of the National Right to Life Committee. He has served in many capacities while advocating for innocent lives, as California Commissioner on Aging, as Chairman of the California Pro-Life Council, on the board of the National Legal Center for the Medically Dependent and Disabled. And now here's our host, Brian Johnston.
Welcome back to Life Matters, we're your program on the right to life and what it really means. It's a very clear and straightforward principle of political philosophy which America's founders established at the beginning of this nation, in which they invoked natural law, the foundation for Western civilization, as indicating that human lives are particularly valuable, that they've been given by a creator, that we've been endowed by our Creator with our right to be alive, and that the job of the government is first and foremost to protect those lives, the lives of the governed. So the right to life is an important principle, and a lot of times people can confuse it with the circumstances under which it's being robbed. We love babies, and we condemn squarely the killing of human babies, which was licensed by Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton in 1973. It unleashed a violence on this nation that kills these innocent children. But in so doing, the Supreme Court authorized medical killing, and the repercussions have echoed through our culture. We're going to talk about that some today, and we're going to continue to talk about COVID-19. The illness that is the result of the SARS-2 COVID virus. It's very important. We've talked about it a lot. We can't get away from it, can we? That wasn't my idea, but it's inescapably being used here by the government to control what's happening. If you're in California, you know that. You know that what the governor is doing and what many mayors are doing is actually invoking this serious issue, but they're doing something that's never been done before in American history, and that gives us pause. So we're going to talk about detailed questions. What is a case of COVID? What is death by COVID? I'm going to present to you official statements of the government. Now, please, I am speaking for myself, as you heard in the introduction. I've represented various and been involved with various organizations. I'm speaking for myself right now, and I'm going to let you know what the government has said. I'm going to challenge you to read these statements of the government. You need to come to your own conclusions. One of the goals of Life Matters is to get you to think a little more deeply about what's going on. What is the right to life, as we said at the top? What is the right to life? It's a very important principle that if we lose it all. I believe firmly that the right to life is a foundational aspect from which all our other rights come. Your right to be secure in your person, papers, and property. Well, that comes from the fact that your life is valuable. Your right to keep and bear arms, that's because you want to protect lives. So the right to life is the foundational premise. We have to understand it and think deeply about it. In today's program, we're going to think deeply about what is happening right now with COVID-19. I'm going to offer you, and you'll find these in the show notes. If you're listening by podcast, you can go to the show notes. I'll give you the exact citations. I want you to think about this. You come to your conclusions about what's happening now in California and across the nation, how the government is addressing this COVID question. And as I said, what is a case of COVID? I'm going to read to you from the CDC Guidelines on what a case of COVID-19 is. And then the question is, how is it reported? You're going to hear from none other than Dr. Birx, and she's going to explain something that should stun you, that other countries will acknowledge underlying illnesses if someone is exposed to COVID, and they'll mark that down. But in the United States of America, she says publicly, no, you will not say that the death is from the underlying illness. You will say it's COVID. even if there's the slightest reason to use the name COVID, that's what the form is going to say. And that will be a death from COVID. And then finally, perhaps the most alarming when you put these pieces together, is a document from Johns Hopkins University newsletter, and where the researcher found that, in fact, people die every day and have been dying every day. And strangely, now with COVID here, the numbers aren't changing. The number of people dying every day has remained the same. If COVID is causing a spike in these deaths, shouldn't this be reflected in the overall numbers of deaths? And yet, the death rate in America has remained the same. This is a startling article. I'm going to read to you from that article. You come to your conclusions about what's really going on with COVID. When you put these facts together, there's something not quite right. As it says in Hamlet, there's something foul in the state of Denmark. Something is rotten here, and we have to find out what it is. So you come to your conclusions. When we come back, we're going to hear from Dr. Birx. Dr. Birx is going to explain that other countries recognize that there's underlying illnesses that kill people. Dr. Birx says our government forms, wherever we can, we're going to say it's COVID. That's scary.
Life Matters continues after this.
Christmas is the time of year when we honor Christ and the fact that God Himself has decided to become one of us. We remember, too, that we, each and every one of us, is actually made in God's image. Each child is an incredible gift of life. If you'd like to help in the battle for life here in California and remember them at this time of year, please go to CaliforniaProlife.org. That's California Pro-Life, all spelled out, no hyphens, CaliforniaProlife.org, and help us as we stand for the cause of life and for each and every vulnerable child.
And now back to more Life Matters with Brian Johnston.
Okay, well, welcome back. As I said, we're talking about COVID again. There have been various episodes. This is a serious issue. We have explored it in episode 234. We interviewed Dr. Stephen Mosher, the world's expert, I believe, in China and what the Chinese government is doing. This disease did originate in China, and Dr. Mosher is convinced, and there's been some strong evidence, it was generated by the Communist Chinese Party. Again, you can go back to episode 234 to hear from Dr. Mosher. But we talk about this illness in great depth, what you can do to protect yourself from it. It is a coronavirus. And what that means is it's very easily spread. The common cold is a coronavirus. And the corona refers to the prickles that come out of it if you look at it under a microscope. And that means it can easily get caught on your skin, caught and then get into your system because of those prickles. It's like a briar. If you have a dog with long hair and it runs out in the weeds, it'll get briars in the long hair. So this is a COVID easily caught virus. We talk about how to protect yourself. That's in 224 and 214. We talk about it. In episode 213, there's so many aspects. Protecting the elderly, as you know, that's been one of my passions. It's not just babies that are vulnerable to medical killing. It's the elderly now in our nation. And so we want to protect the elderly, particularly from COVID. And in episode 211, there's quite a few if you go to the podcast page. This is an important issue. So we're not minimizing it all, but there's something more that the government's not telling you. Let me have you listen to what Dr. Birx tells you. She acknowledges that other countries will state and acknowledge the underlying illnesses that kill people. And that if that person is also exposed to COVID, they will admit that they actually do die from the heart disease or the kidney failure. Dr. Birx here admits that the government forms are designed, and she celebrates this, they are designed to mark that as a death from COVID, even though the underlying illness is what has caused the person to expire. Go ahead and listen. Here's Dr. Birx.
There are other countries that if you had a pre-existing condition, and let's say the virus caused you to go to the ICU and then have a heart or kidney problem, some countries are recording that as a heart issue or a kidney issue and not a COVID-19 death. Right now, we're still recording it, and the great thing about having forms that come in and a form that has the ability to mark it as COVID-19 infection, the intent is right now that if someone dies with COVID-19, we are counting that.
Now that's pretty stunning. We're going to hear from her again. But there's so much more. There's so much more at stake because what are some of the other things that the government is doing? What is a case of COVID? You just heard about a death from COVID, but the CDC has outlined what you can call a case of COVID. And guess what? You don't need to have the virus present. There need not be any laboratory or any other physical evidence that the actual COVID virus is present, and a medical professional can call it COVID anyways. I'm going to read to you from the CDC Guidelines. They use big polysyllabic Latinate and Greek terms. Don't get confused by that. I'll explain this in just a moment. I'll also send you the link. I'd like you to read this link, and you'll see that you can call a case of COVID when there's no evidence of COVID being present. That's kind of scary. And it's scary because as soon as you do, you can get federal money for treating COVID. And it's a lot of federal money because of the CARES Act. Look up the CARES Act. They give out money based on the numbers of COVID cases reported. But what is a COVID case? This is what it says, CDC Guidelines. Epidemiological reports from the field are demonstrating a growing importance of pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic infections from two lines of evidence. The serial interval of COVID-19 appears to be close to or shorter than its median incubation period, and clusters linked to pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic index cases. The CSTE, and the CSTE is the Council of State and Territorial Epidemiologists. So the CSTE, it's based in Atlanta, Georgia, and it works with the CDC. And so they have issued guidelines, and they say that field investigators will involve evaluations of persons with no symptoms, and these individuals will need to be counted as cases. Hello? People with no symptoms, if they come to a hospital and people think maybe COVID's present, you may now mark that as COVID. It goes on. Here's the clinical criteria. At least two of the following symptoms: fever, measured or subjective, chills. So again, they don't have to have a temperature. Chills, rigors, myalgia, that's muscle pain, headache, sore throat, new olfactory and taste disorders. Oh, that orange juice tastes strange to me. So if you have two of those symptoms, and those symptoms can be caused by lots of things, or at least one of the following symptoms: cough, shortness of breath, or difficulty breathing. So if you have two of the previous symptoms, which can come from many things, or at least one of the following symptoms: cough, shortness of breath, or difficulty breathing. If you have one of those symptoms, you can be reported as a case of COVID. You have a cough, we can call it COVID. Why is that important? Again, I urge you to look this up on the CDC Guidelines. The link is going to be in the show notes for this podcast. Once it is a case of COVID and reported to the CDC insists that you not give any other information. You not in that form talk about the name of the patient or any other symptoms. You simply send the form to the CDC. We have a case of COVID here. The CDC is completely unable to double check. They're unable to verify if that was truly COVID. This is after telling them you only need one of the symptoms of cough, shortness of breath, or difficulty breathing. Does that not strike you as odd? Again, I suggest you go to the guidelines You read that yourself. And again, think about what we just heard from Dr. Birx. In fact, let's hear it again. Dr. Birx doesn't want us to be like other countries. Dr. Birx has better government forms to fill out that are really going to help our fight. Listen to Dr. Birx.
There are other countries that if you had a pre-existing condition, and let's say the virus caused you to go to the ICU and then have a heart or kidney problem, some countries are recording that as a heart issue or a kidney issue and not a COVID-19 death. Right now, we're still recording it, and the great thing about having forms that come in and a form that has the ability to mark it as COVID-19 infection, the intent is right now that if someone dies with COVID-19, we are counting that.
Life Matters continues after this.
You know about our car donation program at California Pro-Life. We use one of the most respected programs in the nation. Go to the California Pro-Life page, californiaprolife.org. Scroll to the bottom and click on Donate My Car. It's that easy. Did you know you can also donate any vehicle, boat, motorhome, or even personal property? If you are nearing retirement age, you can also get a tax deduction by earmarking a portion of your upcoming compulsory distributions from your 401k. Just email us for information. California Pro-Life is fighting to equip California pro-lifers with understanding and the tools to again protect the unborn and other vulnerable innocents. Thank you for your help in this battle. Go to californiaprolife.org. That's californiaprolife.org for more information.
And now back to more Life Matters with Brian Johnston.
Okay, well, that's something. What about this? Report from Johns Hopkins University, and I got this article. It's still available online, but the actual version that Johns Hopkins published was removed by the government. And so, thankfully, at the radio station WCK-FM, it's an excellent radio station. They're investigative. They use the news properly. They retained a copy of what's been pulled from the web. And this is what it discusses. The fact is that we're seeing a level state in the rate of deaths. There is no spiking of deaths. There's something wrong with what's being reported. Let me read directly from the study. This is a study from Bryand, who is the doctor publishing the study. And she says this: the death rate of older people is the same before and after the COVID-19 pandemic. Quote, the reason we have a higher number of reported COVID-19 deaths among older individuals than younger individuals is simply because every day in the U.S., older individuals die in higher numbers than younger individuals. Now, understand what she's saying. COVID can contribute. She's not saying that COVID isn't contributing, but they're actually dying from an underlying illness. The problem is the way the CDC has set it up, you don't know if it's COVID that's caused it. We do know that it's their illness that's killing them. I go on. This is what she says in the article. Between 50,000 and 70,000 deaths are seen both before and after the emergence of the virus, meaning that according to the analysis, coronavirus has had no effect on the percentage of total deaths of older people, nor has it increased the total number of deaths in the category. Now, according to the original newsletter from Johns Hopkins, Bryand suspected that the COVID-19 death toll may be misleading, and she found the total decrease in deaths by other causes almost exactly equals the increase of deaths by COVID-19. So for some reason, in the reports, people dying from heart disease has dropped off. People dying of renal failure, that's dropped off, miraculous. But somehow, people dying of COVID has leapt. You heard Dr. Birx. You heard what she said. They want to say that this is COVID. They want to say the death rate is skyrocketing from COVID. That's an official government position. courtesy of Dr. Birx. These reports show that people are actually dying from their underlying illness. Perhaps COVID caused it, but perhaps it didn't. You also heard, and again, I challenge you, you go back and read the guidelines from the CDC in how to report a COVID case. You don't need to have any evidence of COVID being present. And they cannot follow up to check if it was the COVID virus. They're unable to do that in the interest of privacy. They also don't tell you about the CARES Act, because the more cases of COVID, the more money they make. The CARES Act distributes to these organizations, that would be these providers, healthcare providers. They're the ones that need extra federal money. The more reports they have, the more money they get from the federal government. That's according to the CARES Act. And there's $180 billion in the first tranche that goes to the providers. And that's provided directly. As I pointed out, they will not double check because they cannot double check if it actually was the COVID virus. Does something sound wrong to you? I'm just asking. If you could say this is COVID and I'm going to get federal money for saying that, and you can't double check. And if, as Dr. Birx says, we're going to proclaim these are deaths from COVID, even though other countries won't, and other countries realize it's actually an underlying illness. Does that not seem odd to you? And now if you're in California or New York or any number of states that are demanding even more control of the human populace by the medical bureaucracy, this is an important question. And it's one that I've raised before. If you listen to Life Matters, the real issue in the right to life and what happened in Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton isn't merely that babies are being killed. That's an important issue. And we mourn those babies, and those babies are wanted. Again, if there's any listeners who think that a baby has to be killed, we'll find you parents who will love that child, regardless of the child's condition. There's no need to kill these babies. But what happened in January of 73 in the Roe and Doe decisions is the practice of medicine was attacked. For 3,000 years, medicine said it would only care for, and if it could not cure, it would comfort patients, but never harm or killed them. In 1973, Justice Blackmun instructed doctors to kill. This was a challenge to the very premise of Western civ, which is that human beings are special. Again, our founder said that every life is endowed by their Creator. You're made in the image of God if you're a Judeo-Christian tradition. There is something special about human beings. They're not merely smart animals that can be thrown away. That is what defines Western civilization. In January of 73, the medical profession was instructed by the Supreme Court, you can kill human babies. Go ahead. No one's going to investigate. And Doe v. Bolton most explicitly says that. So the challenge of the right to life is first to understand what it did in January of 73, why these killings are so important to understand so that we can stop this abuse of medicine. When medicine is used as a killing tool, it's extremely dangerous. We've talked about that other times with doctors. You need to know that as an individual, that medicine has been perverted in the United States of America. Today's program, we talked about the real facts about COVID. Dig into what they are. You come to your own conclusions. You're going to see those links. You can listen to what Dr. Birx says about deaths from COVID. You can read the CDC guidelines that do not require COVID to be present if you want to call it COVID. You can have very minor indicators, and you can call it COVID. And perhaps most importantly, under the CARES Act, there's billions of dollars that can be received from the federal coffers if you call it COVID. So this is very sinister. In my mind, that's a conclusion I've come to, that something's not quite right in the presentation of COVID. The media does not dig into these things. You're going to have to come to your own conclusions about the media. You're going to have to find out what's really true. You have to want to, though. And that's why we're here on Life Matters. We want to explore and understand the real issues of life so you can be an effective advocate for the lives of others and perhaps even your own life. So let's review. As you know, I've studied this particular illness rather carefully. There are many, many studies available. We've spoken with many, many experts. What do we know? It's extremely infectious as the common cold. Yet the death rate, the actual death rate, is not that high. It is very high for the elderly and those who have immune systems that are compromised. An important element of this. As you know, I've been an advocate for the medically dependent and the disabled, those who are vulnerable to the abuse of medicine. And the first thing, if someone is vulnerable and has a reduced immune system, you want to boost their immune system. You want to help protect them. And yet that is not the approach that the federal government or our state government and many state governments, that's not the approach they're taking at all. In fact, they're doing the opposite of what has been done in human history. In human history, if there's a quarantine, you quarantine those who are actually ill. In this case, the entire state of California right now and many states, they are quarantining those who are not ill. There's something wrong and inverted in the government's approach to human beings. As I said, in Western civilization, a just government treats human beings as more than mere animals. And now let me just cut to the chase. There are some people, and I've heard them conclude this from what you have heard. Well, these people then, they were just going to die anyways. Wow. Think about it. Those folks in the nursing home, they're just going to die anyways. There's certain folks with terminal conditions. People who advocate euthanasia say, let's just speed it up in the name of compassion. And in some ways, this illness fits that model perfectly. A utilitarian view of human beings. They're just going to die anyways. Let's cull the herd. And the problem is, this is dismissing the intrinsic value, integrity, and dignity of the human person. So this isn't just about the death from COVID. Again, look at the actual numbers, look at what actually happens. But this is about how all of society, every human being is being treated now by the government and by a medical profession that in one sense is being used to herd and control society. We want to make sure that those who are most vulnerable are protected. Please do that. We're looking at a time in history where you have to understand the debate and you have to be willing to stand for what's right so that you can help those who are most vulnerable.
Learn more about everything in today's show online at lifematters.life, where you'll find all the resources you need to protect life. Life Matters is a production of the California Pro-Life Council, the state affiliate of National Right to Life.